The first time I heard the chainsaws, a visceral chill shot through me, freezing me in place. The sound was a guttural, tearing roar. It ripped through the absolute, almost sacred silence of the Alaskan wilderness. This sound simply should not exist here. I was deep within the heart of the abandoned Blackwood Logging Camp. I was miles from any active human presence, any working machinery. This place had been a ghost for decades. Rusting equipment lay half-buried in the encroaching moss. Ancient trees grew defiantly through the skeletal remains of old cabins. Yet the distinct, terrifying whine of a saw biting into timber, followed by the heavy, shuddering crack of a falling giant, echoed through the desolate valley. It was too real. It was too precise. It was too horrifyingly present. My breath hitched, caught in my throat. A cold dread seized my lungs, stealing the air. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm in the suffocating quiet. I knew then, with a cold certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the dead weren't resting in this forgotten place, and I was terrifyingly, utterly alone. It was late August. The brief, intense Alaskan summer was already fading. A crisp, biting chill, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, hinted at the coming, unforgiving winter. My name is Alex. I'm a freelance photographer and urban explorer. I am driven by an insatiable curiosity for the forgotten and the derelict. I seek out places where time has stopped. I look for where human ambition has surrendered to nature's relentless reclaim. I document their decay, their haunting beauty, their silent stories. The abandoned Blackwood Logging Camp had been more than just a site on my list. It was a legend among the online exploration community. It was whispered about as one of the most remote, untouched, and potentially perilous sites in the state. Getting there was an ordeal in itself, a testament to its isolation. It involved a precarious bush plane drop-off onto a tiny, makeshift gravel strip. This was followed by a grueling 2-day hike through dense, unforgiving forest. It was a labyrinth of towering spruces and treacherous muskeg. My pack weighed heavy on my shoulders. It was filled with professional camera gear, a compact drone for aerial shots, and enough dehydrated food and emergency supplies for a week. I had convinced myself this was the ultimate photographic challenge. It was a chance to capture the raw, untamed beauty of nature, reclaiming industry. It would be a visual masterpiece of decay and resilience. I didn't believe in ghosts, not in the traditional sense. I believed in rational explanations. I believed in the cold, hard logic of science. I believed in the undeniable finality of death. Blackwood Logging Camp, nestled deep in a secluded valley surrounded by towering, ancient evergreens that seemed to watch with silent, unblinking eyes, felt less like a place of dread. It felt more like an open-air museum. It was a vast, sprawling testament to forgotten lives. It showed the relentless passage of time. It highlighted human endeavor and its eventual, inevitable surrender. It was a place of quiet reflection, a serene, almost beautiful landscape where history slept beneath a thick blanket of moss and fallen leaves. I was utterly, terrifyingly wrong. My initial hours at the camp were exactly what I'd expected. It was a dusty, decaying time capsule preserved by its extreme isolation. The main entrance, once grand, was now marked only by a collapsed wooden sign. Its faded letters were barely visible, almost entirely swallowed by thick undergrowth and grasping thorny bushes. The air hung heavy and still. It was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying wood, and the faint, metallic tang of rust. This pervasive scent seemed to cling to my clothes and hair, settling deep into my lungs. Dust motes danced in the sparse, ethereal beams of sunlight that managed to pierce the thick canopy overhead. They illuminated the slow, quiet decomposition, the inexorable march of time. Each particle was a tiny, glittering reminder of the decades that had passed since life had last thrived here, since the roar of machinery had replaced the silence. Peeling paint curled from the walls of the old bunkhouses. It looked like dead skin. It revealed older, faded layers beneath. These were hints of institutional greens and browns, sickly yellows and pale blues. It was a palette of forgotten toil and quiet despair. Overturned logging equipment lay scattered across the clearing. These were silent witnesses to sudden, almost panicked abandonment. Their cracked vinyl seats and rusty gears told tales of frantic work. They spoke of lives rushing in and out, of desperate measures taken and failed, of last moments frozen in time. Massive, rusted saw blades, once sharp and formidable, now lay half buried in the soil. Their teeth were blunted by time and neglect. Empty cabins lined the muddy tracks that crisscrossed the camp. Each was a small, desolate box, a hollow shell of human habitation. Some still had beds bolted to the floor. Their mattresses were long gone, leaving only the stained, skeletal springs like the remains of former occupants. Others held overturned tables, broken tools, and the occasional discarded boot or crumpled newspaper, yellowed and brittle. These hinted at the abruptness of their occupants' departure. It was as if they had simply vanished mid-sentence, leaving their last moments frozen in time, waiting for someone to find them. I navigated through the camp with a sense of detached awe. My camera clicked constantly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the profound silence. I documented the grim beauty of decay. I captured the way the dappled light fell on a rusted saw blade. I focused on the intricate patterns of moss on a forgotten engine block. I focused on the textures, the colors, the silent narratives etched into every decaying surface. I found the old mess hall. It was a vast, cavernous space that was eerily quiet. A single overturned chair lay in the center of the room. It looked like its occupant had been interrupted mid-meal and simply vanished. It was unsettling, yes. But it was the kind of unsettling that made me feel brave. It was like conquering a forgotten piece of history. I was proving my mettle against childish fears, against the silly ghost stories I'd grown up with. I was just an explorer, a documentarian of the forgotten. I was convinced I was immune to the old legends. My youthful skepticism was an impenetrable shield against anything truly sinister. I spent nearly 3 hours just exploring the main clearing. My initial excitement was still high. My footsteps echoed a little too loudly in the vast, empty spaces. The sounds bounced off the silent cabins, only to be swallowed by the profound quiet, leaving an uncomfortable void in their wake. But then, the atmosphere began to subtly shift. The playful bravado that had buoyed me through the initial exploration started to curdle into genuine unease. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It tightened with every passing minute. It was a premonition of dread that settled deep in my bones. It was a creeping certainty that I was no longer alone, no longer safe. The camp was not merely abandoned, but waiting. The silence, initially a comforting blanket of abandonment, started to feel oppressive. It was too deep, too absolute. It was a vacuum that seemed to swallow every sound, every whisper, every breath. It left a ringing emptiness in my ears. This pressed in on my eardrums. It was a painful pressure. It felt as if the very air itself was being sucked away, leaving me breathless. The distant chirping of birds, once a constant, comforting drone from the surrounding forest, seemed to vanish the deeper I ventured into the camp. It was as if the camp itself was actively absorbing all external noise. It sealed me within its decaying embrace, cutting me off from the living world. It severed any connection to sanity or safety, from time itself. It was trapping me in its endless present. My own footsteps, once a confident crunch on gravel, felt strangely heavy, almost sluggish. It was as if pushing against an unseen current, a thick, invisible resistance. My hushed narrations for the camera seemed to lose their echo. They were swallowed by the suffocating quiet, dying almost immediately after leaving my lips. This left me feeling isolated, adrift in a sea of dread, even from my own voice. I'd hear faint, almost imperceptible creaks from cabins I'd just passed. These sounds seemed to follow me, always just behind my line of sight, or the soft drip, drip, drip of water that wasn't there when I investigated. This sound seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. It was a phantom leak, a constant, maddening rhythm that tapped against my nerves. It was a cruel, mocking metronome counting down to something terrible. A faint, cloying scent, like old, damp earth mixed with something metallic and sickly sweet, would drift past. Then it would vanish as quickly as it came. This left me sniffing the air, confused. It was a taste of something foul on my tongue, something unnatural. Something unnatural. It was something that defied explanation. It was a scent that hinted at decay far deeper than mere rust, a decay of the soul. I found myself whispering even when there was no need. My voice was barely audible. It was as if afraid to disturb something that was listening, something that had been waiting patiently for me. It waited for my fear to ripen, for the perfect moment to reveal itself. Then the first chainsaw roared. It wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. It came from the direction of the old mill. This was a hulking, skeletal structure of rusted metal and splintered wood that loomed against the darkening sky. The sound was unmistakable, the high-pitched whine of the engine building to a crescendo, the guttural snarl of the chain biting into wood, tearing, ripping. It was impossible. I was the only person here. The camp had been abandoned for 50 years. There was no power grid, no fuel, no one. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against my sternum. I scrambled for my camera. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped it. I aimed it towards the mill, hoping to capture some rational explanation, a trick of the light, a falling branch. The viewfinder showed nothing but the dim, decaying structure, silent and still. But the sound persisted. It was a violent, tearing sound. It was followed by a heavy thump that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. A dull, sickening impact. Then silence. Absolute, profound silence. My breath hitched. I slowly lowered the camera. My gaze was fixed on the mill. Nothing moved. The air was still. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, loud in the sudden void. I tried to rationalize it. Wind? A collapsing beam? My mind playing tricks, amplified by the isolation? But the sound had been too distinct, too mechanical, too alive. I forced myself to move towards the mill. Every step felt heavy, as if walking through thick mud. My boots crunched on fallen leaves and splintered wood. Each sound was unnaturally loud. The air grew colder as I approached. It was an unnatural chill. It cut through my layers of clothing, raising goosebumps on my arms. The metallic tang in the air intensified. It was now mixed with the sharp, acrid scent of fresh sawdust. This smell should have been impossible. I reached the mill. The massive rusted saw blade hung motionless. It was coated in decades of grime and decay. But beneath it, on the dusty floor, lay a single, freshly cut log. It was about 5 feet long. Its ends were clean, raw, and bleeding sap. The wood was still glistening. It was impossible. My mind screamed. I knelt. My hand trembled. I touched the cut end. It was still damp. The wood felt strangely warm to the touch. It was a disturbing warmth, like freshly spilled blood. I recoiled, backing away slowly. My eyes were wide, fixed on the impossible log. This wasn't just a sound. This was physical evidence. This was proof. I stumbled back to my camp. My thoughts were a frantic, chaotic mess. I tried to calm myself. I tried to force a rational explanation into the impossible. I set up my tent. My hands fumbled with the poles. My movements were clumsy with fear. I needed to get out in the morning. I needed to leave. But as darkness fell, a profound, inky blackness seemed to swallow the stars. The sounds began again, faint at first. The distant whine of a chainsaw, then another, and another. They seemed to come from different parts of the camp. It was a macabre symphony of phantom industry. It was the ghost of a logging operation, resurrected by some unseen force. I huddled in my tent. My flashlight was clutched tight. Its weak beam was a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, playing tricks with the old machinery. But the wind didn't make those sounds. The wind didn't make the ground outside my tent subtly heave. It was as if something enormous was shifting just beneath the surface, pushing up from the earth. I heard heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, outside my tent. They circled, then stopped. A deep, resonant thump shook the ground. It was directly beside my head. I squeezed my eyes shut. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sounds penetrated. The chainsaws roared. They were closer now. They were right outside my tent. They were tearing at something. The air grew impossibly cold inside my sleeping bag. I could feel a presence. It was immense. It was ancient. It was malevolent. I knew then I wasn't alone. I was trapped. The night became a living nightmare. The chainsaws didn't just run, they worked. I could hear them. They moved from one part of the camp to another. They were felling phantom trees. Their ghostly forms crashed to the ground with deafening, invisible force. They were cutting phantom logs. The blades tore through unseen timber. The sounds were horrifyingly realistic. It was a symphony of destruction, the sharp crack of a tree falling. This was followed by the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of logs being dragged across the unseen ground, the grinding of gears from the old mill, the creak of unseen cables. It was all happening in the dark. It was just beyond my tent walls. It was a horrifying, unseen ballet of death and industry. I pressed myself against the cold, damp ground inside my sleeping bag. I tried to make myself as small as possible. My heart hammered like a trapped bird, frantic and desperate. My breath came in ragged gasps. Each inhale was a struggle against the suffocating cold. I tried to reason. I tried to find a logical explanation. I tried to cling to the scientific mind I prided myself on. It was an echo. It was my imagination. The isolation was getting to me, but the sounds were too clear, too precise. They were too physical. They were undeniable. I heard the heavy footsteps again. They were closer this time. They were slow. They were deliberate. They were outside my tent. They circled. Then they stopped. A deep, resonant thump shook the ground directly beside my head. It vibrated through my skull, rattling my teeth. I squeezed my eyes shut. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sounds penetrated. The chainsaws roared. They were right outside my tent. They were tearing at something. The air grew impossibly cold inside my sleeping bag. I could feel a presence. It was immense. It was ancient. It was malevolent. It pressed against the thin nylon of my tent. I could almost feel its weight. It was a crushing presence, a suffocating force. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the fabric. It was not human. It was not animal. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Then, a single, sharp rip. The sound of fabric tearing, loud and violent in the oppressive silence. My tent was breached. I screamed. It was a choked, desperate sound, barely a whisper. I scrambled backwards, pressing myself into the furthest corner. My body trembled uncontrollably. My flashlight beam, shaking uncontrollably in my hand, cut through the darkness. It illuminated a gaping tear in the tent wall. Beyond it, in the moonlight, stood a figure. It was impossibly tall and gaunt. Its silhouette was a stark, terrifying contrast against the faint light. Its limbs were like stretched wire, unnaturally elongated and spindly, ending in sharp, almost claw-like points. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was observing me with ancient, malevolent intelligence. Its eyes were two pinpricks of profound darkness. They were voids that seemed to drink the light. They left only a deeper absence in their wake. It wasn't a shadow. It was an absence. It was a gaping void in the shape of a man. It actively absorbed all light, all sound, all hope. It pulled the very essence from the air around it. A chilling vacuum pressed in on my eardrums. It was a painful, deafening silence that screamed of emptiness. The air around it grew impossibly cold. A biting, unnatural chill sucked the warmth directly from my skin. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, my jaw ached. This cold reached into my very bones, freezing the marrow and turning my blood to ice. A faint, metallic tang, like old blood and ozone, filled my nostrils. It intensified as I stared. The scent pricked at the back of my throat, making me want to gag. It tasted of something ancient, unholy, alien, and deeply wrong. My breath hitched, caught in my chest. A primal scream threatened to tear from my lungs, but no sound escaped. My vocal cords felt frozen solid. They were trapped by sheer terror, by the entity's very presence. My mind reeled. I frantically searched for a rational explanation. A trick of light, a hallucination, a desperate figment of imagination, anything but this impossible truth. But my eyes, wide and fixed, refused to look away. I was drawn by a horrifying fascination, a morbid curiosity. It felt like a betrayal of my own survival instinct. It was a dark impulse to understand the horror before me. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to flee, to escape this waking nightmare. But I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. I was a deer in headlights, utterly helpless. And then it moved. With slow, deliberate grace, more terrifying than any sudden lunge, it glided. Its movement defied friction and gravity. It was as if through thick, unseen water, or as if it simply willed itself forward. It took a single, silent step towards me. Its form grew infinitesimally more defined with each terrifying inch. It solidified from nightmare into undeniable reality. This horror was no longer confined to the shadows. It was stepping out into my world. It was stepping into my tent. It was stepping into my space. I scrambled out of the tent. Adrenaline flooded my system with a burning, desperate energy. My legs, stiff with cold and fear, threatened to give out. But primal instinct propelled me forward. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I just ran. I ran through the dark, overgrown camp. My boots slipped on the damp earth and hidden roots. The sounds of the chainsaws followed me. They were closer now. They were right behind me. They were tearing at the air. They were tearing at the trees. I could hear the whine of the blades. I could hear the snap of branches. I could hear the heavy thump of unseen logs hitting the ground. It was a chilling echo of the work that had once defined this place. It was a relentless pursuit. It was an auditory assault that left no room for thought, only raw, unadulterated terror. My flashlight beam bounced wildly. It illuminated fleeting glimpses of rusted equipment. It showed decaying cabins. It showed the dark, menacing shapes of the ancient trees. They seemed to reach for me. The cold intensified. It was not just the Alaskan night. It was the cold of the entity. It was the cold of the void. It was chasing me. It was a palpable, suffocating presence. I burst out of the main camp clearing. I plunged blindly into the dense, unforgiving forest. The trees were a labyrinth. They were a wall of darkness that seemed to close in around me, trapping me. I stumbled over roots. I crashed through thick undergrowth. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging welts. My lungs burned with the effort. Each breath was a searing pain. My legs ached, screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop. I could hear the entity behind me. Its heavy, deliberate footsteps crushed the fallen leaves. It was a slow, methodical rhythm that promised inevitability. The chainsaws roared louder. They were now seemingly all around me. They were cutting through the very air I had just occupied. They were cutting through the unseen branches just above my head. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my boots. It was a deep, unsettling thrum. I could smell the fresh sawdust. It was a sickeningly sweet scent of recent impossible destruction. It was impossible. How could something so large move so fast through such dense terrain? How could it use chainsaws without hands? My mind screamed for answers, for logic, for any shred of sanity. But there were no answers. Only terror. I ran until my body finally gave out. I collapsed against the base of a massive spruce tree. I was gasping for air. My vision swam. The world tilted precariously. The chainsaws roared around me. It was a deafening symphony of malevolence. They seemed to be everywhere. They were above me. They were below me. They were cutting at the very forest itself. They were reshaping it. They were consuming it. I squeezed my eyes shut. I pressed my hands over my ears. I tried to block out the impossible sounds, but the sounds penetrated. They burrowed into my skull, resonating deep within. Then the whispers began. They weren't from me. They were from the forest. They were from the very ground beneath me. They were faint at first. They sounded like dry leaves skittering across linoleum, or the rustle of old paper. They were just at the periphery of hearing. It was a soft, almost imperceptible rustle. It was like someone breathing too close, just out of sight. It was a cold breath on the back of my neck that raised goosebumps. Then they grew. They formed fragmented, guttural sounds. They were always just out of focus. They were like a radio station struggling for reception, or a voice speaking from underwater, or from deep within my own skull. It was a chorus of unseen entities clamoring for my attention, demanding to be heard, demanding recognition. A low, incessant murmur seemed to emanate from the very walls of the forest, from the floor of the earth, from the empty air itself. It wasn't human. It was a chorus of agony, of profound emptiness. It was something ancient and hungry. It was a language of pure despair. It was swirling around me. It was growing louder, more insistent, more demanding. It was a swirling vortex of torment. It was a symphony of the damned. Join us, Alex. Join the quiet. Become one. Become nothing. Become Blackwood. Become the hum. Become the void. We are waiting for your light to join our darkness. The words were indistinct, overlapping. It was a cacophony of suffering that clawed at the edges of my sanity. It was a symphony of those who had been consumed. Their voices were a desperate, chilling invitation to join them in their eternal torment. Sometimes I swore I could hear my own name, drawn out and chilling. Alex! It was a seductive, terrifying lure. It promised a cessation of the gnawing anxiety that was beginning to consume me. It was a false peace and surrender, a final, profound oblivion. It felt like a terrible secret, a dark initiation. It was a gift I never wanted. It was a burden that would forever bind me to this place, to its endless night. I don't know how long I lay there, huddled at the base of that spruce. Hours, days. Time lost all meaning in the face of such overwhelming terror. Eventually, the sounds faded, the cold receded, leaving behind a lingering chill that felt permanently etched into my skin. I slowly opened my eyes. The sun was rising. It painted the sky with colors that felt obscene after the darkness I had witnessed. It was a mockery of beauty and life. I was still alive. I was still me. But something had fundamentally changed. I eventually found my way back to the bush plane drop-off point. I was guided by a desperate, instinctual need to escape. I flagged down a passing pilot. His face was a blur of concern. I didn't tell him what happened. I couldn't. Who would believe me? I just said I got lost. I said the wilderness had been too much. I'm home now, thousands of miles away from that desolate camp. But the silence in my apartment is never truly silent. I still hear the faint whine of chainsaws when I'm alone. It is a distant, phantom echo. I still feel the cold spots in my apartment. These are sudden pockets of unnatural chill that raise the hairs on my arms. I still wake up in a sweat. I am convinced I can hear the ground outside my window heaving. It is as if something enormous is shifting just beneath the surface. Blackwood Logging Camp left its mark. It's a chilling, indelible stain on my mind. It is a permanent scar on my soul. A piece of its endless night followed me home. It will follow me forever. I explored an abandoned logging camp, and the chainsaws still ran without anyone there. And I realized I wasn't alone at night. Not anymore. I never will be. The days that followed my escape were a haze of exhaustion and a lingering, profound dread. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to stretch too long. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like the heavy, deliberate footsteps I had heard outside my tent. Sleep offered no respite. My dreams were a terrifying replay of the camp. The endless roar of chainsaws, the chilling whispers, the gaunt, shadowy figure pressing against the tent fabric. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, convinced I could still smell the acrid sawdust and that sickly sweet metallic tang. The familiar comfort of my home felt alien, tainted by the memory of that place. I tried to distract myself, burying my head in work, editing photos from other, less terrifying expeditions. But the images of the Blackwood camp, even the mundane ones, seemed to carry a subtle distortion, a faint, grayish haze, like a veil over reality, just as my disposable camera had produced in the hospital. I'd zoom in, pixel by pixel, searching for an anomaly, a hidden face, a lurking shadow, convinced that the camera had captured something my eyes had missed in my terror. The most disturbing change was the silence. Before Blackwood, silence had been peaceful, a welcome absence of noise. Now it was oppressive. It was too deep, too absolute. It felt like a vacuum waiting to be filled by the phantom sounds of the camp. I started playing music constantly, anything to fill the void, to drown out the imagined whispers. But even then, I'd sometimes get a faint, almost imperceptible rustle, like dry leaves skittering across a floor, or a soft drip, drip, drip of water that wasn't there. It was a constant, maddening rhythm that tapped against my nerves, a cruel, mocking metronome counting down to something terrible. I found myself checking locks multiple times, peering through peepholes, convinced that the entity or something it had sent was waiting just beyond my door. My scientific mind, once my impenetrable shield, was now a prison of doubt and paranoia. Every rational explanation I tried to construct crumbled under the weight of the impossible. A freshly cut log in an abandoned mill, chainsaws running without power, a figure that was an absence of light. These were not things that could be explained away by wind or imagination. I tried researching the history of Blackwood Logging Camp, online forums, old Alaskan historical archives, local newspaper clippings. What I found was sparse, fragmented, and chillingly consistent. The camp had indeed been abandoned abruptly in the late 1940s. The official reason was a sudden, unexplained drop in timber yields and a series of unforeseen operational difficulties. But deeper digs, obscure local legends spoke of something else. Whispers of loggers going missing, not just one or two, but a steady trickle over several months. Tales of strange sounds emanating from the deep woods, sounds that were not animal, not human. Rumors of a whispering sickness that afflicted those who stayed too long in the camp, driving them mad with paranoia and visions. One particularly chilling, unsourced account described a logger who, after a night alone in the camp, was found the next morning in a state of catatonia, his eyes wide and fixed, repeating only one phrase: "The forest is hungry. It wants its trees back." He died a week later, seemingly from sheer terror. Another spoke of a camp boss who, in a desperate attempt to keep the operation running despite the disappearances, ordered his men to cut down a particularly ancient, massive spruce tree deep within the valley, a tree locals had warned against. After it fell, the sounds began, louder, more aggressive, and the disappearances escalated. The camp was evacuated shortly after, deemed unprofitable and unsafe. The implications were horrifying. The entity wasn't just haunting the camp, it was the camp. Or rather, it was the spirit of the forest, enraged by the logging, by the destruction. It had absorbed the essence of those who worked there, their fear, their toil, their very lives, and used them to continue its work, to reclaim what was taken, to punish those who dared to trespass. The chainsaws weren't just echoes, they were a manifestation of its rage, a twisted, eternal logging operation fueled by the stolen life force of its victims. The figure I saw, the gaunt, void-like presence, was perhaps the embodiment of this ancient, vengeful spirit, or perhaps a composite of all the lost souls, twisted into a horrifying form. The whispers were the voices of the consumed, their agony and their desperate pleas, now part of the entity's chorus, beckoning new victims. I stopped going outside after dark. I installed multiple locks on my doors and windows. I even bought a small portable generator, convinced that if the power went out, the silence would be unbearable and it would come. I started drinking heavily, trying to dull the edges of the terror, to silence the whispers that now felt like they were in my own head, not just outside. My friends noticed the change. I was jumpy, withdrawn, my once sharp wit replaced by a haunted stare and sudden outbursts of paranoia. They asked what happened in Alaska. I gave them the sanitized version. Bad weather, rough terrain, a particularly aggressive bear. They looked at me with concern, but they didn't push. They couldn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen the impossible. They hadn't felt the cold of the void. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and the hum of traffic fades, I still hear it. A faint, distant whine, like a chainsaw starting up. And I know, with a sickening certainty, that Blackwood Logging Camp isn't just a place on a map. It's a living, breathing entity, and a piece of its endless night followed me home. It will follow me forever. I explored an abandoned logging camp, and the chainsaws still ran without anyone there. And I realized I wasn't alone at night. Not anymore. I never will be. The forest is still hungry, and I was the one who woke it up.